If you've ever wondered how a single tree nut once fed entire civilizations before we wrote it off as squirrel food, or why a lump of butter dug out of a swamp can still be edible 1,000 years later, and many more forgotten foods besides, stay with us. Acorn. For thousands of years, the acorn was one of the most important foods on Earth, a free harvest that fell from oak trees by the ton and fed whole civilizations. Native Californian peoples built their entire diet around it, and it remained a staple across Europe, the Middle East, and Korea. The catch is that most acorns are loaded with bitter, mildly toxic tannins. The fix, worked out independently around the world, was to shell and grind them, then rinse the meal in water again and again until the tannins washed away, leaving a mild, nutty flour. That flour became bread, porridge, and the wobbly Korean jelly called dota hurimuk. Some oaks, like the holm oak of Spain and Portugal, drop acorns sweet enough to roast and eat whole, and during the World Wars roasted acorns were ground into a coffee substitute. What was once survival is now, in most of the West, left on the ground for the animals. Nettle. The stinging nettle defends itself with tiny hollow hairs that inject formic acid and histamine into any hand that grabs it, yet for most of human history, it was a prized spring green. Cooking or drying instantly destroys the sting, leaving a leaf richer in iron and protein than spinach, with a deep, savory, almost meaty flavor. Across Europe, the first nettles of spring were gathered as a tonic after a long winter of salted food, boiled into soups, stirred into puddings, and even brewed into a light nettle beer. The plant was also grown for its fibers, spun into a linen-like cloth used to clothe soldiers when cotton ran short. It grows as an aggressive weed almost everywhere humans disturb the soil, which is exactly why it followed us and fed us for so long. Pemmican. Long before the protein bar, the peoples of the North American plains built the ultimate survival food. Lean bison meat was dried until brittle, pounded into a powder, and mixed with an equal weight of melted rendered fat, sometimes with dried berries worked in. Sealed away from air, this dense paste kept for years without spoiling, delivering thousands of calories in a small, portable block. The Cree word behind it, pemmican, gave pemmican its name, and it became the fuel of the North American fur trade, carried thousands of miles by canoe. Later it powered polar expeditions to both ends of the Earth, since almost nothing else delivered so much energy per ounce and survived so long in extreme cold. It was, in every practical sense, the original energy bar. Samphire. On the sea cliffs of Britain and the Mediterranean grows rock samphire, a salty, crunchy sea herb that people once risked their lives to gather. It clings to bare rock faces above the crashing surf, and collectors would lower themselves down on ropes to cut it, a job Shakespeare called a dreadful trade in King Lear. Prized for its briny, citrus tang, it was pickled in barrels and shipped inland by the cartload in Georgian and Victorian England. A second plant, marsh samphire, also called glasswort, grows in coastal mudflats and is the bright green sea vegetable sold today under the name samphire. Both taste of the sea, a salty snap that needs no seasoning, and both were once gathered wild long before anyone thought to farm them. Cattail. The tall reed with the brown, sausage-shaped flower spike, found in almost every marsh on Earth, has been called the supermarket of the swamp because nearly every part of it can be eaten. The thick underground roots are packed with starch that can be dried and ground into flour. The young shoots, peeled and eaten raw or boiled, taste like cucumber and were nicknamed Cossack asparagus. In summer, the green flower heads can be boiled and stripped like tiny corn cobs, and the bright yellow pollen above them is a fine, protein-rich flour of its own. For foragers and survival experts, few plants offer so much food from a single stand, and it grows freely wherever there is fresh water and mud. Beyond food, the dried leaves were woven into mats, and the fluffy seed down was used to stuff pillows and insulate winter clothing, making the whole plant a source of shelter as much as supper. Bog butter. Across the peat bogs of Ireland and Scotland, people spent thousands of years burying butter in the ground, and archaeologists still dig it up today. Wooden kegs and baskets packed with butter, some more than 3,000 years old, keep turning up in the peat, some weighing as much as 80 pounds. The bog is a natural refrigerator, cold, airless, and acidic. It halts the bacteria that would normally spoil the fat, so the butter survives for millennia, slowly hardening into a pale, waxy, cheese-like substance. No one is certain why so much was buried. Some was surely stored to keep it cool and safe, but the sheer age and quantity of some finds hint at offerings to the gods or the earth. Archaeologists who have tasted the youngest samples describe a strong, ancient, gamey tang. Fat hen. Before spinach reached European tables, the everyday leafy green was a common weed called fat hen, a wild cousin of quinoa whose leaves and tiny black seeds have fed people since the Stone Age. It grows fast on any disturbed ground, and both the mild spinach-like leaves and the starchy seeds were eaten as a staple. The most vivid proof of its importance lies in the preserved stomachs of Iron Age bog bodies. When scientists examined the last meal of the Toland man and others pulled from Danish bogs, they found a porridge thick with fat hen seeds, eaten more than 2,000 years ago. The plant never vanished. It still sprouts in gardens and fields everywhere, dismissed as a weed by people whose ancestors depended on it. Hardtack. For centuries, the food that kept armies marching and navies afloat was a biscuit so hard it could break teeth, made from nothing but flour and water and baked bone dry. Hardtack lasted for years at sea when fresh bread would have molded in days. Sailors soaked it in water, coffee, or stew just to make it chewable, and gave it grim nicknames like tooth dullers and worm castles because it was so often riddled with weevils. The standard trick was to tap a biscuit on the table to knock the bugs out before eating. It was miserable food, but it was reliable, and it fed the age of sail and the soldiers of many wars. Some pieces have survived so completely intact that they sit in museums today, over 150 years old. Pignut. Hidden a few inches under the soil of old meadows and woods across Europe grows the pignut, a small, knobby tuber about the size of a hazelnut, with a sweet, crisp, nutty taste somewhere between chestnut and raw carrot. For generations it was a favorite wild snack, especially for country children, who learned to trace its thin, brittle stem down through the earth to the buried nut below. The digging is the hard part, because the fragile stalk snaps easily and the tuber sits several inches down, deeper than it looks. Pigs root them up eagerly, which gave the plant its name. Once a common free treat of the countryside, the pignut is now almost entirely overlooked, known mainly to foragers who still enjoy the patient hunt. Shakespeare even put it in the mouth of Caliban in The Tempest, who offers to dig pignuts for his new master, a small sign of how ordinary a wild food it once was. Pine bark bread. In the far north of Scandinavia, the inner bark of the Scots pine was not a symbol of starvation but a regular ingredient, ground into flour and baked into bread. Between the rough outer bark and the wood lies a soft, pale layer called the phloem, and this was peeled off in spring, dried, and pounded into a fibrous meal that stretched scarce grain. The Sami people harvested it carefully in strips that let the tree survive, and pine bark bread remained part of the northern diet for centuries, becoming a lifeline in the famine years that struck Scandinavia into the 1800s. Far from empty filler, the inner bark carried fiber and nutrients, and modern researchers have looked again at a food that quietly kept people alive through the hungriest winters: salsify. In the kitchen gardens of the 17th and 18th centuries, one of the most popular root vegetables was salsify, a long, slender, pale root nicknamed the oyster plant for the delicate oyster-like flavor it takes on when cooked. Its darker cousin, black salsify or squirrel nera, was grown the same way and prized just as highly. Both were boiled, fried, and baked into pies and stews across Europe, a fashionable vegetable on tables rich and poor. Then, over the last century, they quietly slipped off the menu, crowded out by the potato and the carrot, until most shoppers today have never heard the name. The oyster plant still grows easily, its purple, dandelion-like flowers opening in the morning and closing by noon, which earned it the old country nickname, Jack go to bed at noon. A faint taste of the sea in a roadside weed is now the only quiet reminder of a vegetable that once stood among the favorites. Sea kale. Along the shingle beaches of northern Europe grows sea kale, a wild coastal cabbage that Victorian gardeners turned into a luxury. Left alone, its leaves are tough and bitter, so growers learn to force it, covering the emerging spring shoots with tall clay pots or heaped sand to block the light. Starved of sunlight, the shoots grow pale, tender, and sweet, a delicacy served with butter that graced the finest Regency and Victorian tables. It was so fashionable that wild sea kale was gathered nearly to extinction along parts of the British coast, and it is now a protected plant. Rarely seen in any market today, it survives mostly in a few specialist gardens, a lost vegetable that was once the height of springtime fashion. The great gardener of the age, the same man behind the modern seed catalog, championed it so heavily that for a while, no fashionable kitchen garden was complete without a row of clay forcing pots hiding the pale shoots beneath. Cardoon, a tall, silver, thistle-like plant with a fierce, spiny look. The cardoon is a close cousin of the artichoke, but here it is not the flower that is eaten. Instead, cooks harvest the thick, celery-like stalks or ribs, which are blanched pale, then boiled and braised into a nutty, faintly bitter vegetable that tastes of artichoke heart. The Romans loved it, and it stayed a favorite through medieval and Victorian kitchens, though preparing it is real work, since the stalks must be trimmed of spines and their stringy edges. The plant hides one more secret. The flowers of the cardoon are used as a vegetarian rennet, curdling milk to make certain traditional Spanish and Portuguese cheeses. Grand in the garden and demanding on the plate, the cardoon slowly faded as easier vegetables took over. Alexanders. Long before celery reached northern Europe, cooks flavored their pots with a tall, yellow-green herb called Alexanders, carried across the continent by the Romans. Nearly every part of the plant was useful. The celery-like stalks were blanched and eaten as a vegetable, the leaves seasoned soups and stews, the flower buds were pickled, and the small black seeds were ground as a peppery spice. For centuries, it was a mainstay of monastery gardens and kitchen plots across Britain and Europe, valued as an early spring green when little else was growing. Then, in the 18th century, milder, less bitter celery arrived and pushed it aside almost completely. Alexanders never disappeared, though. It still grows wild in thick stands along the coasts and hedgerows of Britain, a Roman import gone feral, waiting to be rediscovered. Good King Henry. A hardy, unassuming plant of the old cottage garden, Good King Henry was grown across Europe for centuries as a perennial spinach, sometimes called poor man's asparagus. Its young shoots were cut and eaten like asparagus in early spring. Its leaves were cooked like spinach, and its flower buds were eaten too, all from a plant that came back reliably year after year with almost no care. Despite the royal-sounding name, it has nothing to do with any King Henry. The name traces to old German folklore about a helpful household spirit, meant to set the useful plant apart from a poisonous look-alike. Once a fixture of the vegetable patch, it faded as annual spinach and cultivated asparagus took its place. And today, it survives mostly in heritage gardens, a quiet reminder of a plate that used to include far more than the supermarket now offers. None of these foods vanished because they were bad. They were pushed aside as farming narrowed, trade spread, and the supermarket taught us to expect the same few crops all year round. Yet almost every one of them is still out there, growing wild in a marsh, a hedgerow, or a stretch of coast, waiting for anyone curious enough to look. Let us know in the comments which forgotten food we should dig up next.